Andy Johnson, Minnesota State University. We are looking at some of the basics of educational research. Knowing just some of this stuff will help you be and become a more responsible consumer of educational research. First of all, when someone says the scientific method, what do they mean? Well, the traditional view of science and the traditional view of the scientific method goes something like this. You have two groups. You conduct a study. You measure them before the study. You have some sort of treatment to one group and not the other. The two groups are the same in every respect except for the treatment, and then you do a post measure after the study. Now, if there's a difference between the two groups in this post measure, and the difference between the two groups is statistically significant, that is a statistical formula to determine if the difference is greater than could happen by chance, then you could say that the treatment is the cause of that difference. It's all about finding causal relationships, one thing causing the next. And by the way, to be a true experiment, subjects have to be randomly selected and put into groups. However, in education, we can't randomly select our subjects because students exist in schools and classrooms. So we do what's called quasi-experimental research. This is research in which the subjects are not randomly selected. So you use some sort of pre-study measure to assume the groups are relatively equal. And that's the subject of another video. There's also what's called the single subject design. And this is just the very basics. But you have a measure of some sort before the study. You have a treatment, and you have a measure after the study. If the difference between pre and post is statistically significant, you can say with certainty, or with some certainty, that the treatment was the cause of the difference. Of course, there's a whole bunch of confounding variables that we can't control, such as maturation and exposure to other things. But that's just an overview of what most people consider the scientific method. However, there is no such thing as the scientific method. Instead, there are methods of science, different ways of asking questions and collecting data to answer those questions. Now, to assume that the only scientific method is controlled experimental research using the two controlled and experimental, that's like looking at reality through a peephole. Gives you a very narrow view of reality. It insists, if that is the scientific method, that the same methods used for studying bacteria in a petri dish should be used for studying children in a classroom. Now, controlled experimental research is a valuable tool, absolutely. However, the exclusive use of the controlled experimental research creates a peephole view of reality. And I'm a literacy professor, so it creates a peephole view of reading reality, that you see a little spot of reality, but you miss a whole bunch. You see a little bit clearly, but you miss a whole bunch of data and phenomena outside your little peephole. You cannot use the same methods of science in the physical sciences as you do in the social sciences. We're not studying bacteria in a petri dish. We're studying human beings in a classroom. Another type of research is qualitative research. This is another method of science. Instead of trying to manipulate reality by controlling variables, qualitative research takes reality as it is. The goal is not to make causal relations, although there's some of that. We can see the causal relations between this and that, but the goal is to understand reality, to make connections. We look at phenomena, and we look for patterns to emerge, and we use inductive analysis. That is qualitative research. So science is simply asking questions and using data to answer those questions. The method of science that you use should depend on the question asked. Yet there are groups like the U.S. Department of Education and the Council of Exceptional Children that says, no, you must use our way of asking and answering questions. The only method of science that counts for creating knowledge is the controlled experimental research. So they're forcing us to look at reality like this, and we say a very clear view of a narrow range of phenomena, but we're missing a whole bunch of stuff on the peripheral. Some examples. Is method X effective in improving students' word reading fluency? Well, yes, that clearly calls for quantitative research, controlled experimental research. What type of miscues do non-fluent readers make? Well, that calls for qualitative. How do non-fluent high school readers deal with the demands of homework? Again, qualitative. Does reading volume have a significant impact on students' reading fluency? Quantitative, controlled experimental research. Do maze and close activities? Yes, quantitative. What type of early literacy experiences are typical of fluent early readers? Again, that is qualitative. The question should determine the type of research and the research methods used. The research methods should not determine the question. If that happens, you get a very narrow range of questions asked, and you get a very unreal view of the reality you're trying to look at. So research is simply a way of seeing and seeing again. It's a procedure or procedures used to view and review the world in order to understand it. It's a systematic way of collecting data to answer questions. It's not higgledy-piggledy. There is some system and systematic method used by the researcher through which the world is viewed, and different research methods or lenses provide different views of this reality. And another thing about research. Research is not research unless and until it has been subjected to blind peer review. Now, many people would just collect data and say, well, my research shows. People with an agenda do that. Think tanks often do that. For-profit products, people do that. They collect data and they said, well, our research shows that our method is better than other methods. Imagine that. Their research shows that their product is better. Research is not research unless it's sent off to a jury of one's peers. They don't know who you are. They review it. They say, yes, the methods are sound. They are objective. It's set in a solid theoretical context. That is blind peer reviewed. And they say, yes, we should publish it. No, we shouldn't. Research is not research unless and until it has been subjected to blind peer review. It should be subjected, not subjective. We all make errors. Good research does not start with an answer. You're not collecting data to prove your point, although we have a general idea. But good research uses the data to answer your question. Good research, you have the ability to prove yourself wrong. There are two general methods of science: quantitative, which is the controlled experimental research, and qualitative. So let's take a look at quantitative research. Here, the researcher takes an active role in setting up the observation or experiment and isolating the variable. A variable is any quality or condition about which the researcher wants to draw some conclusion. In education, it's often which approach is better, or what are the effects of this approach. The goal of experimental research is to demonstrate a causal relationship between this and that, between an approach or treatment and a variable. So the researcher isolates all the variables except one so they can make this causal relationship. The independent variable is the treatment, often the approach, what you try to make independent of everything else. You control all the variables except for this one. The dependent variable, that's the data or the effect. It's the treatment or the particular approach you use, often. The treatment group or experimental group, they are exposed to the treatment. It's called the independent variable, made independent of everything else. The control group is as similar as possible to the treatment group, except they are not exposed to the treatment or the independent variable. In a controlled experimental research, quantitative research, there is a research question. And if you're reading a research article, this is found after the lit review. This is the question for which the researcher seeks to find an answer. The researcher is collecting data to answer that question. The hypothesis, sometimes called the null hypothesis, is a statement that's either supported or rejected by the research data. It's a declarative statement that can be answered yes or no, supported or rejected by the research. Now, a theory here in research is not an unproven or untested assumption. That is a hypothesis. A theory here is a way to explain a set of facts which are used to understand phenomena. Each fact is a bit of research, and the theory connects the research dots like a dot-to-dot picture in order to explain and understand phenomena. However, one of the things about a controlled experimental research, as I've said before, used in the social sciences, is that by manipulating reality, you make it a non-reality. By controlling it so much, it does not become natural. Now, that does not mean it shouldn't be used. It should not be used exclusively. And in controlled experimental studies, one of the limitations is that only data related to the research question are observed and recorded. You get a very clear view of a very narrow range of phenomena, but it misses a lot of data that's not in your very clear view. And again, this is not to discount it or say it shouldn't be used. Controlled experimental studies should not be used exclusively. Other thoughts about quantitative research or the controlled experimental research? It uses numbers to reach a state of knowing. It quantifies reality. If it can't be quantified, it can't be known. The questions are stated up front before the research begins. Great, great, great. But it does not allow the question to evolve as the experiment evolves or the research evolves. Only the data related to the questions are collected. So yes, you're going to miss some data. And it creates the illusion of objectivity by not using first-person narrative. By writing in an objective tone, you give the illusion of objectivity. But here's the thing. Subjectivity exists by the questions asked, by the type of data collected, by how the data are interpreted. This idea that you can be an objective observer stepping outside of reality just is not plausible. You are objective in the questions asked, the type of data collected, how the data are collected, how the data are interpreted. It uses a cause-effect paradigm to make sense of the world. This treatment caused that effect. That's all well and good if we were living in a purely mechanical world. But the social world is not purely mechanical, and the quantum world is not clearly mechanical. So this often leads to the arrogance of certainty. Yes, our research proves that. These are the numbers. Well, certainty is not to be achieved. We can minimize uncertainty, but certainty is not to be achieved. Now, qualitative research, on the other hand, it's a systematic observation, not higgly-piggly, used to reach an understanding of phenomena. They take the world as they find it. They do not manipulate it. The questions are more open-ended. They're not declarative statements with a yes or no answer. There's plenty of room to reach or collect collateral data around the edges. So instead of a very clear view of a very narrow range of phenomena, you have a wider lens of a wider range of phenomena. And you see this classroom here. It's not a petri dish to be manipulated and controlled. There are real human beings mucking about there in reality. In qualitative research, the research is allowed to evolve the initial question as the circumstance evolves, because you're looking at real people and real human phenomena. It is a systematic observation, means that you have a plan for how you're going to collect data, when you're going to collect data, and how long. In qualitative research, you want to use at least 2 data sources to make sure you're getting a view from different sides. And you want to look long enough and deep enough. Meaning that if you go into a classroom and look for a day, well, you're going to understand something. But if you go into a classroom, spend 4 hours for 40 days, you're going to understand more. So to understand the reality you are observing, you want to look long enough and deep enough. In qualitative research, the onus is on the researcher to establish credibility. So you state any biases up front and you try to be as credible as possible. Qualitative research is like Jane Goodall sitting in the middle of a bunch of gorillas trying to understand that phenomena, taking notes. Except you're sitting in classrooms, you're taking notes, you're understanding. Qualitative research collects a variety of data. You could collect students' actual products. It includes surveys and interviews, among other things. Which one is better, quantitative or qualitative? Oh, we used to have those arguments, which are silly. And again, one is not better than the other. They should both be used. The question, however, should dictate the type of, not question, another error, should dictate the type of research used. The question should dictate the type of research method used. However, I will say this, numbers by themselves without context can lead to a misunderstanding. The U.S. Department of Education, as I said, has a very limited definition of research. This is the only research that counts as knowledge. This is ultimately detrimental to the field of education. They like to say, oh, these are the research strategies that have been proven effective. And you say, well, effective for who? For what purpose? How are they implemented? The arrogance of certainty. So, 3 terms you need to be aware of: validity, reliability, and triangulation. Validity is the degree to which a thing measures what it is report to measure. How do we know your data actually assesses and describes what it says it does? For example, if you wanted to understand and report students' ability to write, well, you could use a standardized test of grammar and punctuation, or one of those on-line timed writing tests. But that does not reflect reality. I'm a real writer. Sometimes my grammar and punctuation isn't just right. I have never been timed to write a chapter. Okay, Dr. Johnson, you have 20 minutes. Write your chapter, go. A more valid measure of students' writing ability would be their actual writing products, checklists of some sort, mini checklists over time, or rubrics. So validity, the degree to which something measures what it reports to measure. Reliability is the degree to which a study or experiment can be repeated with similar results. And again, experimental research strives to create this hermetically sealed world with all the variables controlled so that you can say X can be used to cause Y beyond all doubt. However, the real world is a messy place. Human beings are not inclined to exist in hermetically sealed worlds. We expect to find and see different things in different classrooms at different times. Qualitative research, they look to notice patterns. Inductive analysis is used to record and observe these patterns and put them into groups and to report general trends or themes. In qualitative research, the goal is not to generalize. This will occur in every classroom when that happens, but to understand similar situations, to understand what's happening here. The last term, triangulation, means looking at something from more than one perspective, and I use the term of a triangle to help me observe. Two data sources, you see the same thing from slightly different angles. 2 or 3 data sources. So in qualitative research, triangulation is achieved by using different types of data. And as I said earlier, you want to have at least 2 types of data sources. Looking at things at different times, different ways of collecting data, and having different people review your data and data sources. That is triangulation. Validity, does the thing measure what it purports to measure? Reliability, will I get the same results? And triangulation, looking at something from more than one perspective. Just some basics of educational research.